So to kick off our conference, allow me to now introduce our keynote speaker, Eric Lander. As Dan mentioned, Eric is the President's Science Advisor and Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is now a cabinet-level agency. I first met Eric over 30 years ago when he was recruiting me for my very first academic position. Then, like now, he combined a towering intellect with a twinkle in his eye. No one I know infuses a love for science and learning as much as he does. He combines a deep knowledge of multiple domains with a passion for making society better. Eric is a geneticist and a molecular biologist and a mathematician who is the principal leader of the International Human Genome Project. He is the former president and founding director of the Broad Institute at MIT and Harvard, and one of the nation's leading research institutes that works on genomic medicine and makes genomic data broadly available to the scientific community. Eric, welcome, and please share your screen.
Thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak at this conference and to visit Stanford HAI. I'm intrigued by the meeting's goal, the radical proposals for a better society. Because like the word radical comes from like the Latin word for root. So to be radical is to go to the root of something. And when it comes to AI, I think going to the root means figuring out what's fundamental. What are the principles? What are the rights? Now, I got to say, I'm speaking to you right now from Glasgow, Scotland, from actually the UN Climate Summit, where I just ran a panel an hour ago. And it's obviously the climate crisis is a very important global challenge. But what you're working on, as you're discussing at this conference, is also a really important challenge for the future of the world. And so that's why I was excited to come and speak to all of you today. I'm here in my role as President Biden's science advisor and the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. But by training, I'm a mathematician and a biomedical scientist. And as somebody who loves mathematics and loves science, I'm excited about how AI can be such a powerful and useful tool for language translation and cancer screening and AlphaFold for folding proteins. I'm also impressed, frankly, as a mathematician, by just beautiful recent advances in theory to understand why AI works well. I love the recent papers on double descent, showing why over-parameterized models can be so effective, avoiding the classic overfitting problems and actually generalizing well. It's gorgeous. At the same time, I also know that powerful tools can cause harms unless we set high expectations and enforce those expectations. And with AI, as you've already said, we know, just to cite a few examples, it can lead to issues with facial recognition that can give rise to wrongful discriminatory arrests, healthcare algorithms that systematically discount the need for medical attention for Black people with multiple serious health conditions because they tend to consume less resources, a beautiful study a year or so ago, or the severity of kidney disease in Black people, preventing some from getting kidney transplants. And of course, hiring tools that can learn the features of a company's existing employees and reject applicants who are dissimilar from the existing staff, despite their being well qualified, for example, women computer programmers. So at OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, we're working on trying to identify what would be a Bill of Rights for Americans living in an AI-powered world. We announced that we were starting this project and seeking input in a recent op-ed in Wired that OSTP Deputy Director Alondra Nelson and I co-authored. And I should say Alondra Nelson, who is an amazing social scientist, is the first ever Deputy Director of OSTP for Science and Society. There's never been this title before, and we have it, and she's an amazing person in that role. And our thinking was that soon after ratifying the Constitution, Americans adopted a Bill of Rights to guard against the powerful government we just created. We enumerated, guarantees, freedom of expression and assembly, rights to due process and fair trials, protection against unreasonable search and seizure, And throughout our history, we've had to reinterpret, reaffirm, and periodically expand those rights. So in the 21st century, we got the sense that we probably need a Bill of Rights to guard against the very powerful technologies that we've created. Now, I'm not here to tell you what that Bill of Rights should be because we're still collecting input and talking to experts and doing work. Instead, I'm here to ask you to do work, to ask for your help, perhaps to give some homework assignments because I'm still a professor on leave, admittedly, at the moment, and this conference is at a university. So let's dive in. In the last 5 years, there's been a lot of attention to the question of AI ethical principles. I've even been involved in some of those discussions, and various groups have proposed ideas. OECD, the G20, the Defense Department's Defense Innovation Board. I served on that for a while. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence in the US, Google, IBM, Microsoft, civil society groups. Recently, the EU has drafted legislation. Some of these groups are US-based, some transnational. The approaches differ for various reasons, including potentially different legal and regulatory frameworks, but we can learn a lot from looking at all of these ideas. And I note that in these things, the ideas range widely over many different types of issues that they seek to address, including things like in the context of, say, an electric utility or a military, being able to regain control from an AI system that might be malfunctioning or run amok. So it's worth saying, what do we mean at OSTP by an AI Bill of Rights? We've tried to bound the scope of the problem. We are focused on systems that make direct judgments about benefits and harms to individuals, which people are going to be granted or denied benefits, who will or won't have access to opportunities, who may or may not be harmed. We're focused on ways to translate those rights that individuals have in a pre-AI world into a world where AI is involved in many important decisions. So to be clear, we are not focused right now on the quality of AIs that interpret yeast gene expression, protein folding, playing Go, controlling energy efficiency in a plant. There are other applications that have critical issues. For example, AIs that control self-driving cars. We need to be concerned with product safety around those things, but that's not part of this project. I note some philosophers will remind me that self-driving cars could involve rights issues if they encounter the trolley car problem, choosing between which pedestrians to hit. But let's steer clear of that for now. So, we're also not concerned with research applications. We're, talking about code that's deployed in products and could help or harm people. For research, researchers should experiment with all sorts of things and learn about things that work and that don't. It's very much like the way FDA regulates medical products that could help or harm people. It's when they're actually going to go into people that we really have to be concerned. So we're focused on a fairly bounded set of circumstances, but within those set of circumstances, we think there needs to be careful scrutiny. And we're not just talking about general principles and best practices. We're interested in rights with teeth. What kind of teeth? Well, the US government by procurement can enforce certain things. State governments could choose the same sort of things by deciding what requirements they'll place on procurement, by potentially laws that are enacted and litigation that is brought. So we want to really think through things that could be practical to really protect people. And look, we see this as a way not to limit innovation. We see this to improve the quality of products by not rewarding people who would cut corners and instead setting ground rules to reward people who would produce safe, effective, fair, equitable products. So I'm here because I don't know the answers, and I want to ask for your ideas about how we might do this, both here in this conversation and also afterwards. You can find my email address easily enough. So look, some of the themes that keep recurring in proposals concerning AI ethics recur so often that they seem like basic expectations of what people want from AI. Things like governance, privacy, consent around the use of personal data, fairness, explanation, transparency, human accountability. The question is, how do you give effect to these ideas? And that requires a pretty clear understanding of what we're trying to do and how to do it. And that's, again, where we need your help and the help of everybody. So I'll dive into a few things. A right to govern your own personal data. What might that mean? Well, right now, of course, it largely consists of notice and consent, terms of service that are very long, very hard to interpret, and force you to say, okay, if you want to use the product because you're in a rush. That give you, basically you have to give over all of your data, or you can't use the service or the app sometimes, or give you relatively limited choices. And frankly, that's the last you hear of what's ever happened to your data. I think we all agree that is not meaningful governance and consent over your personal data. I've heard interesting ideas about how you might turn this into a meaningful right. For example, where you have layered consent. My data can be used for purpose X and sold or given to company Y, but with, say, a legally binding obligation to abide by the same restrictions, including passing on those restrictions. Where there's an obligation, say, to regularly report to me which organizations have my data and how they've used it. Where you could withdraw your data retrospectively, forcing organizations to delete it. And, so as not to place the burden on the individual, perhaps where people can delegate the operation of that right to an agent on their behalf, an organization that would electronically handle the consent and the review and the reporting and summarizing it for you so you could see how your data was getting used and whether you were comfortable with it. Now, I know you have a session today on data cooperatives, which I think is along these lines. And so, the questions are things like this a good idea? Can they be made technically feasible, truly meaningful? What alternative approaches might be used? So your homework assignment, if I'm still allowed to assign homework, is how do we make consent meaningful? And how do we make sure users' permissions are actually followed in ways that are accountable and enforceable? What about a right to fairness? What should this mean? And how can it be made operational and enforceable? So I am very aware of the challenges in defining algorithmic fairness. For example, a paper 2 years ago at the FAT conference about 21 definitions of algorithmic fairness. It can seem totally daunting, and yet we have to make choices because we need to be sure that in a diverse nation like America, AIs are fair for everyone. And I've heard ideas about how you might turn this into a meaningful right. For example, should you have a right that, the data sets used to create the AI have been fully described? That is, right to know what data were used in creating and testing the AI. That the data sets used to create the AI are properly representative of all relevant subgroups, which will surely require oversampling of some subgroups and not just using data sets of convenience. You can't just say, pick as your data set people who work at a tech company. That would not be really a very adequate data set, for example. A right to expect that the inputs used to create the AI are appropriate to the task. One issue that I say bothers me personally is that some algorithms used in the criminal justice system for setting bail are based on responses to questions that aren't really about you, but your environment. Like, tell me about your neighbors and friends if they've ever been victims of crimes, and penalizes you for that. That seems to me fundamentally wrong. What about the outcomes? Should we say that the outcomes used to create the AI are appropriate to the task? So again, just picking on algorithms used for setting bail, some are trained not to determine if a defendant will actually commit another crime, but instead to predict whether the defendant will be arrested for committing another crime. There's a difference because policing rates and policies vary across neighborhoods. It can be a big difference. What about expecting that AIs, importantly, have comparable performance in each relevant group. It's not okay if a credit rating agency has an overall high accuracy, for example, in predicting which applicants will repay their loans, but poor accuracy, for example, making those predictions for Black applicants. And we really have to look at comparable accuracy across groups. So let's just drill down on another example. Suppose a facial recognition system says it has an error rate of only 1% overall. Well, the claim is interesting, but it raises a lot of questions in the context of fairness. 1% across the whole population, but much higher on some subgroups. People of color, for example, 1% for smiling, well-lit faces scraped from Instagram, or 1% on people in surveillance photos on a street with a variety of facial expressions, with people wearing a variety of clothing around their faces, with varied lighting. Now, how was accuracy tested? And of course, if biometric analysis performs with comparable accuracy across all groups under relevant circumstances, there's still separate and important civil liberties questions. When should a government be engaged in conducting such surveillance at all? Likely, at most, under very limited circumstances. Are these the correct questions? What alternative approaches might be used? So again, your homework assignment. I mean, we're still in the data gathering. How can such rights be made meaningful, technically feasible, and legally enforceable? What about a right to transparency? Well, there should, of course, be a right to know if a decision about loans or hiring or bail is being made by an AI or influenced by an AI. Say, ranking applications so that the hiring manager will probably only look at the top set. But, should you also, hang on one second here. But you also have a right to say that any AI being used to make decisions about you has been certified by an independent third-party auditor to be fair, according to some of the fairness criteria that we talked about above. And I know you have a session today on third-party auditing. I think that's a really interesting and important thing. So in fact, though, one might even go beyond just having a third-party auditor. Should you, open question, require that the AI itself be available for testing by anyone? For example, by requiring that there be a server running a working copy of the AI that allows anyone to run large-scale tests to probe the system. It's a little bit like, bug finding. The Department of Defense actually pays bounties for bugs. So maybe we don't just want a third-party auditor. Maybe you want the power of lots of people being able to find issues and bugs. Of course, most individuals are not going to exercise that right themselves, but civil society organizations or agents on their behalf may take that responsibility for the public. Perhaps, who knows? Again, these are things that have been raised to us. There should be a right that the software itself be made available, the actual code be made available in the context of a lawsuit. So I or my agent could inspect it, perhaps under seal to protect trade secrets, but not saying that I don't have access to it in any form. Anyway, bottom line, transparency is a mean to an end, and the end is trust. So the community, the computer science community spent years researching how to build systems where we can trust and verify. And we should apply that knowledge to building systems that can be trusted by all people. Your homework assignment is go figure out how to do this. Here's another one. What about a right to clear explainability? So, on many applications of AI, huge models turn out to be very powerful. And we're interested in explainability as a tool for discovery. What features of a protein sequence, for example, have we been missing that explains how it folds up? What features of a retinal fundoscope exam have we been missing that reveal early diabetic retinopathy? And look, there are rigorous methods that people have developed for assessing the influence of each input variable or set of variables on a classification decision or a prediction. But that's not the point when we're considering AIs that make decisions about humans that affect their benefits, opportunities, and harms. I think a lot of people have pointed out that people have a right to decisions that are legitimate, or more precisely, that people consider to be legitimate. If you're going to deny me a benefit or inflict harm on me, frankly, whether you're a human or an AI, I'm entitled to know why. I'm entitled to an explanation. The decision can't be arbitrary, capricious, or discriminatory. The explanation needs to be clear and understandable. And this is not a nice to have, it's a must have for legitimacy. I'm very interested in work by people like Cynthia Rudin at Duke, who won this year's Squirrel AAAI Award for Artificial Intelligence for the Benefit of Humanity, for her work focusing on interpretable models, on accessibility and ease of use. Such models will be seen as more legitimate, and rightly so. Where simple models do roughly as well as complex models, simple models should be strongly preferred, perhaps. And in situations where complex models dramatically outperform simpler models, we're still going to need explanations. And when it comes to decisions about humans, well, inscrutability will not do. And you can't just get away with saying the algorithm did it. So we're going to still need the ability in such models to attribute decisions to human understandable factors. And that means ultimately there's going to have to be human accountability, an actual human who can explain and defend and be held responsible for a decision, or at least these are things that have been argued to us and that I think are really interesting. So the homework assignment, again, how can these rights be made meaningful, technically feasible, and legally enforceable? Again, I'm tearing through these things, not to say that this is what we think the rights should be, but it's to say we're trying to actually dig into the possibilities for the rights and what they might mean. And so I'm being granular to give a sense of the kinds of things we'd like to hear from you. Tell us, no, that's totally wrong. This isn't the right way to think about it, or that's unworkable. All those are fine answers. But let's actually dig into what it would mean to have a world that was AI powered, in which we were still able to preserve the kinds of rights we believe that at least citizens in our country, and perhaps with variations, citizens elsewhere are entitled to. So look, I've touched on a variety of different rights. How should AI developers today, even in advance of that, produce systems that respect these kinds of rights? Well, I think we'd all agree it requires incorporating rights by design from the very start. It's not a little check you run at the end. And as many people have noted, the best way to do that is to ensure that the developers of AIs have a diverse range of perspectives and experiences, so you catch issues early, so that there are empowered voices around the table that say, wait a second, what about that? Should that be an enforceable right? That the AI systems get built? I don't know. I mean, I don't exactly know how you do that. But I got to say, I could imagine that in a lawsuit, perhaps a plaintiff might justifiably someday raise the issue that failing to have a broad enough range of perspectives around the table to spot important issues represents a failure to exercise due care in designing the AI. I don't know. That would be an interesting point we could see. So look, I apologize for giving a lot of homework, but I am used to teaching classes. I taught freshman biology for 30 years and love it. And because I really want your help, we all do. Alondra and I and lots of other people at OSTP want your help as we think about how to navigate these issues. We're just starting. We're trying to toss out things concretely rather than in some vague, bureaucratic speak or something like that. So forgive me for putting things very directly, but it's meant intentionally to provoke you, to share what you think, do better. The answers will ultimately make a big difference to the future we choose. So let me just close with one last request. I hope that some of you will think of applying your talents in service to the US government full time, at least for some period of time, either to help us create policy or also for us to use AI well within the federal government to serve the American people better. We have so many important, exciting problems to solve in science, technology, and digital innovation that affect the lives of millions of people. Some of you know my career as a scientist, working in academia for my whole career, and might be surprised that I'd agreed to go serve in government. But it is such a consequential time for our country and for our world. I felt that doing my part is a responsibility and a happy one. I hope some of you will feel the same way. We need people like you who are listening in the US government, people who have technical knowledge and who care deeply about people. I think you'll find the chance to serve as tremendously meaningful opportunity. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I'm happy now to throw it open to discussion.
Thanks so much, Eric, for those wonderful remarks and for the call for service and a homework assignment that is worthy of many dissertations, I think. I should note that there is a deadline of that dissertation, which is, I think, on January 15th is when the comment period closes on that initial request.
On the initial request for input, but the comment period remains open and must remain open with the whole community.
Of course, it is an ongoing dialogue. We have a first question by Dr. Fei-Fei Li, who's the Sequoia Professor of Computer Science.
Hi,
and
Fei-Fei.
the Denning co-founder of Stanford HAI. Let's see if we can pipe Fei-Fei in.
For those of us who are committing our work in human-centered AI to develop and practice AI that improves the human condition, we're very excited to see that you're leading an effort to develop a Bill of Rights for an AI-powered world. My question is, why limit this to AI? Needless to say, AI is a huge driver to the changes of our world. But there are also other important technological trends that are going to shape humanity's future, including the field you're very familiar with, gene editing, and also existing technologies such as social media and frontier technologies such as quantum computing. Do you foresee that there would be a separate Bill of Rights for every major technological trend? Personally, I would like to advocate for a Bill of Rights framework surrounding the set of technologies that are digital and compute focused instead of just AI. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
What a great question. So my answer very squarely is you have to start somewhere. And so I think if we choose such a large scope as our very first thing, I don't know that we can do a very good job. So I think there are many areas where we need to think about what are the rights and what are the rules. And I don't know if a Bill of Rights approach was the right approach to many of them. I was involved in a national academies, actually a committee involving multiple national academies on germline genome editing. And a lot of work was put into trying to develop principles there. I don't know if a Bill of Rights is the right thing, but your point that powerful technologies have tremendous opportunities to help people and tremendous opportunities to go wrong. And we should be thinking about those so that we make sure we get the benefits. We've chosen AI because there's been so much attention to it, and there are so many uses of AI that are very close to things that the law often thinks about, a set of well-defined rights in. But I'm thrilled, Fei-Fei, that you are thinking about this, and all of us should be. I think 30 years ago, 50 years ago, when I was growing up, we saw the power of technology, but we didn't always reflexively ask, and what could possibly go wrong? There's nothing wrong with asking what could possibly go wrong. It's a moral obligation of scientists to ask that question. It's build great technologies and ask what could go wrong in advance so we can prevent it. So I'm down with the program, but I find the AI Bill of Rights a large enough thing as a first bite. So I hope you will forgive us for not doing all of it, but I hope the Stanford more generally and others will take on these questions. And who knows, once you get us to a great place with this, who knows what we should turn to next.
Well, I really appreciate what you're doing with that, Eric, and I appreciate your attitude that it's not just science for its own sake, but we need to think about its effects on society, and the work you're doing with Alondra and making her look at science and society, and the Bill of Rights is a big part of that, as we said in the opening. I want to ask you a question from a perspective of an economist. One of the things that economists have learned is that basic research is a key driver of higher living standards. In fact, we could argue it's the biggest single driver of higher living standards. The ROI on the kind of genomic research where you were a pioneer has been just stratospheric. Basic research is also a public good that calls for government investment. And Congress is now considering a lot of legislation, increasing public investment in a lot of different ways. I'd like to hear concretely from you, what are some of the science and technology priorities that you'd like to see better funded, particularly in areas relating to AI, but feel free to be broader about that. And relatedly, how can we combine public and private investment to have the biggest impact?
Well, it's a great question. I'm going to not say what should be more funded right now, because in my job, it's not entirely appropriate for me to do that. The administration puts forward a plan. And so instead, I'm just going to respond to areas that I think are amazing opportunities right now, but not pass on particular allocations of funding and adequacies of them. And you'll forgive me for that and understand, I'm sure. But, I'm sitting here at a climate conference. We're sitting here at COP26. Just think of the power of innovation. In the 1970s, the Department of Energy invested heavily in innovation. And it was a major source of the innovation that gave rise to solar and to wind and battery technologies. And in that period, solar, for example, was 100-fold more expensive than fossil fuels. And it seemed like a pipe dream to imagine it would ever be affordable. Well, by 10 years ago, it was only 10-fold more expensive. But by today, it's on par or cheaper than fossil fuels. That kind of an amazing transition, and it's not done yet in terms of where it could go. Well, it isn't just those renewable technologies that we take for granted today. There's a whole list of things that we need ferocious innovation. Yes, we need ferocious deployment of the existing technologies that we invested in before with public dollars and have now given us, just as you say, private companies that are able to, build large wind turbines that generate power. But I see a long list of investments that we need to make as governments, as in some cases philanthropists, to make sure that we have all of these technologies that could provide, for example, firm, non-variable power sources and things. And so there's lots of discussion going on here today. Today happens to be Science and Innovation Day at COP26 about this. But I could go on in many areas. I think in the biological sciences, there are so many technologies that could only be discovered through basic research as public goods, but give rise to 100-fold more in terms of applications to health. So, I won't give you my long list of all of it, but there's an amazing cycle here where we have public investment that gives rise to public goods, which give rise to private investment that give rise to products. And I think no place like America has institutionalized that so well, but we have to keep ferociously investing in it.
Great. Well, I wanted to ask you a question following up on your mention of code availability and transparency and relate that a little bit to kind of a question about open science. In the Human Genome Project, there was the storied kind of competition between Celera and publicly funded efforts that you led, with worries about patenting of the human genome. And in the AI space, one of the kind of interesting emerging areas of concern is that we're seeing a kind of shift towards much more of the locus of research being within industry, where trade secrecy and patent restrictions may be more prevalent than in academic research. So 10 years ago, PhDs were about equally likely to go into industry versus the academy. Now it's about 2/3 that enter industry versus the academy. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, both as part of the AI Bill of Rights and the National AI Strategy more generally, of what you see as the role of public investment and open science.
Well, if we go back to the Human Genome Project, we're talking about information, the sequence of the human genome, that is foundational to 10,000 applications, 1 million applications. It should be a public good. The idea that that would be behind the paywall would be so inefficient, so wrong, because it would limit innovation. On the other hand, the idea that somebody develops a drug and has to conduct an expensive clinical trial, they're not going to invest unless they have some degree of IP protection, so that somebody doesn't come along as a free rider later and just says, well, I'm going to free ride on the work you did to demonstrate the effectiveness of the drug. So, as I'm sure both of you think about all the time, it's getting that balance right from fundamental knowledge that will empower many things to incenting and rewarding investments with limited time ability to be able to recover those costs and profit on top of it. It's not always clear how to get it right. The fact that so much AI is being done in industry, of course, relates to the fact that you need very big machines to do much of it. Although I must say, a lot of amazing discovery is still coming out of academia at this point, and a very good thing. And I've got to say, some of the companies are putting a lot of their ideas and algorithms out into the public domain, because I think some of them see the benefit of creating a vibrant public ecosystem that they themselves will benefit from. So we have to be careful about all of those things. We've got to have a vibrant academic and public sector. And we've got to have a corporate sector that views itself as responsible stewards of an ecosystem as well. And that'll come from values and connections between the academic and the corporate world, and pushing people and reminding people of what they need to do to make that work. So it's a great question. There's no magic formula to use in each case, but I think there are a set of principles, and these are things that should be debated frequently and openly with all of the parties in the ecosystem. So I know we're out of time. We're not anywhere near out of questions, but right. Anyway, thank you for letting me just throw out ideas. I'm not sure I particularly, endorse any one idea I've tossed out. I've tossed them out to be provocative. I have to underscore that before somebody writes and says, how could you believe X? I don't know. We're trying to learn. And I thought this was, when I got the invitation from you guys to come speak, I thought this might be an amazing audience where I could shamelessly ask for help. Or can easily find our address. And please write to us. I can promise you we will read about it, and we will read it, and we will think about it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. We were really honored that you took the time to join us, and we're so glad you're doing what you're doing in Washington. As a professor, I appreciate the homework you assigned to all of us, and we're going to get to work on that as much as we can by the January 15th deadline. But thank you also for the extension in advance. And we'll be working with you to help address these really important issues. Thanks again for doing what you're doing and devoting your prodigious talent and energy there as the science advisor. We do have a lot of other questions, but we have to move on. And I think Dan is now going to introduce the next session. Thanks so much, Eric.
Thanks so much, Eric.